right, if you have your sheet this evening, we're going to, I guess if you want to open up to Romans 13 and put a bookmark there, we'll get there in a few minutes. Got a few other scriptures we're going to bounce around to before we get there, but Romans 13 is going to be our main text today, this evening. All right. Let's go ahead and pray, and we'll get started. Father, thank you for your goodness to us. Thank you for your mercy and your grace. Lord, I pray that you help us as we study your word this evening. Lord, help us to come to a better understanding of these principles from your word. And Lord, I pray that you help us be faithful and diligent Christians. Please bless our time together in Jesus' name. Amen. So, we are finally reaching our last of the Baptist distinctives. First one began with B, and it was Bible as the sole authority. And the second one began with an A, autonomy. Third one, a P, priesthood of the believers. B-A-P-T, his first T, two ordinances, which are baptism and the Lord's Supper. I, individual soul liberty. First S, dealt with church membership. Saved and baptized church membership. Our second T, two offices, which are priests and cardinals, right? Priests and cardinals. Okay, bishops and deacons. And then finally, our last distinctive, S, is the separation of church and state. Now, when we talk about separation of church and state, we are not talking about freedom from religion. Okay? Religion does belong in the state to a degree. Not in the way it has been sometimes interpreted throughout history, but it does belong there. So, separation of church and state. God established both the church and civil government. He gave each a distinct sphere of operation. Purposes of government are outlined. Sorry, I lost my place. There it is. Purposes of government are outlined in Romans 13. Churches are outlined in Matthew 28, 19, and 20, and the Pauline epistles, where these are in conflict, meaning the church and the government, where our principles are in conflict. We ought to obey God rather than man. That's a very clear principle in Scripture. So, we have God instituting both the church and the state. Matthew 16, Jesus gives kind of a prophecy that he's going to build his church. That's where he announces that he's going to have his ecclesia. And I do think it's interesting because ecclesia itself is a government, somewhat of a government term. It means an assembly, but any governing body is an ecclesia. So it wasn't a new word that Jesus was coining. But Jesus says, I'm going to build my church. I'm going to have my ecclesia. It's going to be something that is separate and is distinct from the governments that already existed at the time. It came into being in Acts chapter 2. The government, you remember, initially, if you remember when we were talking Genesis 9 in Sunday school here a 3 weeks ago, something like that, a month ago, talking about the establishment of civil government when Noah and his family got off the ark. So that's when government was first instituted, where God gave humanity the responsibility to set apart a group of people who are going to govern. Now, it's interesting because the church didn't start way back then. The church started several thousand years later. So, obviously, the church and the government there's supposed to be a separation between those two. And so, each of them has a distinct sphere of operation. Neither of them is to control the other. It is not the responsibility of the church to control the government, nor is it the responsibility of the government to control the church. In some ways, we need to stay out of each other's businesses in a sense. They're not to be joined together. There is to be a separation of church and state. Now, a lot of people like to bring up this whole idea of separation of church and state. Separation of church and state is not in the Constitution, not in the Bill of Rights, not in the Declaration of Independence. It appears in one letter written by Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association of Virginia. And what that essentially had to deal with is, in order to ratify the Constitution, the states then in existence had to agree upon the Constitution. Well, the state of Virginia was not agreeing to it. And that was largely because of the great Baptist influence that was there. It was largely, not necessarily a Baptist state in the sense of a state church, but Baptists were so prevalent in Virginia. And so they wouldn't agree to it. And so there was correspondence between the Danbury Baptist and Jefferson. What's going on? We need your support here. And their contention was, there's no Bill of Rights. What's to ensure that if we agree to this Constitution, that we're not going to wind up with the same problems we had under the Crown that we just overthrew? And so Jefferson writes to them to affirm, look, there will be a clear separation of church and state. And I think it was either Madison or Adams. I think it was Madison. It was Adams? Okay, Madison, thank you. And he had a relationship with Elder John Leland, who was a Baptist evangelist at that time. And he told Leland, look, you influence the Baptists and tell them to vote for me, get me put into, I think it was Senate at the time, and my first duty will be to put before the Senate a Bill of Rights. And so that's how that ended up going on. So that's where the separated church-state came from. But that has always been a Baptist principle. That has been a principle of the church since its foundation. And this stems largely from our understanding of individual soul liberty. Baptists have always maintained that any devotion to God must actually come from the heart. You can't legislate that. You can't dictate a person's conscience. Sure, you can force a person to get baptized. That doesn't mean that they believe. That doesn't mean that they're in their heart they're following. You can go through the ceremony. You can go through all the motions, but if the heart's not in it, it's just an offense to God. God hates that as much as actually, I think God is more upset with that than he is the people who don't know him at all and are doing contrary to him. So, we believe in the individual soul liberty. That leads to a separation of the church and state because you can't legislate a person's conscience. Therefore, the government is not to govern the consciences of men, nor is the church to enforce morality on society. It's not for the church to say, oh, this person committed adultery, we're going to bring them before the church, we're going to excommunicate them from the church, and then we're going to burn them or hang them or cut off their head or whatever. That's not our responsibility. Now, if the government decides they want to do that, and the government can do that, that's their sphere of authority for those types of things, but that's not for us to do. We don't get to carry that out. Now, we can hold each other accountable. We can discipline somebody on the church level and put them out of the church. We can, in certain instances, we can turn them over to the powers that be, as we should, to enforce things. But when it comes down to it, it's not for us to enforce morality on society. Now, this does not mean that Christians are not to be an influence and that the church is not to be an influence in government. When our government in particular was set up, it was set up with the intention that the church would be the moral compass of this society. And a lot of the problems we have is because the church decided, you know what, maybe we ought to be a little quiet and not get so political in our preaching and teaching and stuff like that. And we backed out of that sphere, and so our influence went away. We need to get that back. But notice here, let's talk about the church for just a moment. We're not going to belabor this particular point because the main thrust of this is on the church, of this study, these lessons. But the purpose of the church is given in Matthew 28. Now, Matthew 28, 19, and 20 is the Great Commission. Go ye therefore, teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. So that's our commission. So to teach all nations, it means to make disciples of all nations. That's our purpose. We make disciples, we baptize those disciples, and then we teach them how to be disciples. That's what we're supposed to do. That's our commission. That's God's purpose for the church. Now, that obviously that breaks down into many different facets, but that's just a real bottom line. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And while the church as an institution is not to be joined to the state, that does not mean believers are not to be involved in state affairs or function as regular citizens. So just because a person gets saved doesn't mean we have to leave society. We don't have to be like a First Baptist monk or nun and join a baptistry. Sorry, that's a bad joke. But we don't need to join monasteries. We don't need to become Amish. Leave society. We function as regular citizens because that's how you are a light to the world. You can't be a light to the world if you're not in the world. The Bible is very clear. We're supposed to be in the world, but not of the world. So we don't leave society, but we try to be a light in whatever corner of society we are in. That's what we're supposed to do as believers. So we don't leave society. We can be in state affairs. Let's look at some of these things. Let's go to Luke chapter 3. We are going to get to Romans 13 here in just a minute, but I want to notice these things. Because, and we'll talk more about it when we get to it. When you look at the Anabaptists, for instance, the Anabaptists were known for their pacifism. So you'd have like the Mennonites, the Amish would kind of fall under that category to a degree. The Hutterites would kind of fall under that. And today there's still Anabaptist groups out there, or they call themselves Anabaptists. But they're pacifists. They don't believe really in self-defense at all. They don't believe Christians should be in politics. They don't believe Christians should be involved in the military, the police force, anything that had to do with the state. And reason is because they misunderstand this concept, and there's a little bit more to that. You figure the day and age in which they lived, if you were to be a soldier, for instance, in the military you're working for is a state church governed by which church? But in the Catholic Church. And what is the Catholic military doing? Who are they waging war against? They're forcing conversion and trying to kill off the Baptists. How do you do that as a Christian? You can't do that. And the only way that you could be in the military or in any type of government office to be a citizen, well, the only way you can be a citizen is if you are baptized into the Catholic Church, and your children are baptized in the Catholic Church. That's the only way you can be a citizen. So how can you do that? You can't. Because a lot of those people got converted and left the Catholic Church. They were excommunicated. So they were excommunicated from the state. They lost their citizenship. They were disenfranchised. So, and in that sense, you can understand how a person could get the idea, well, we can't be in the military, we can't be in politics, stuff like that. Which at that time, legally they could not. But there's nothing biblically to forbid them to do that. But that's where the idea gets started. So notice here, Luke chapter 3, notice verse 12. This is a group of people coming to John the Baptist for baptism. Then came also publicans to be baptized. Publicans. What's publican? They're a tax collector. These are traitors. These are the people that work for the IRS. Everybody loves the IRS, right? And so these people were doubly despised, not only because they're tax collectors, but because they're Jews that sold out their own nation and became employees of the Roman Empire. So they come to John, having repented. They're coming to be baptized. They said to him, Master, or teacher, what shall we do? He said unto them, exact no more than that which is appointed you. Well, that's pretty basic, isn't it? Does he say you need to leave your office? Stop being a publican? Stop working for the government? No, he just says, don't extort. Because that's what they would do. They had a certain tax that they were required to take from people to pay the government, and then they could exact however much more above that they wanted to. So, I mean, you get a guy in a good area of town, and he's going to become a very wealthy man. And John's saying, that part you need to stop. But you don't need to stop collecting the taxes. Notice this, verse 14. And the soldiers likewise demanded of him, saying, what shall we do? He said to them, do violence to no man, neither accuse any falsely, and be content with your wages. He doesn't say, stop being a soldier. He doesn't say, get out of the military. He said, but when he says do no violence, what Roman soldiers would do is they would use intimidation to, show their power and to kind of beat people into submission. Don't do that to people. Be good to them. Be content with your wages. Don't cause uproars. Don't cause a fuss. Just accept what you're getting and work with it. Notice here, neither publicans nor soldiers are told to give up their stations as an act of repentance. Remember Cornelius? What was he? He was a centurion of the band called the Italian Band. Now, that's not a rock group. That is a group of soldiers that was stationed in Caesarea. But he was a centurion. He was over 100 soldiers. He was a military, actually he would have been a politician. He would have been kind of in that city, he would have been acting almost like a governor in some sense. And when he gets converted, Peter doesn't say anything to him about getting out of the military, giving up his station there. Doesn't say anything about that. There's nothing in the passage to indicate that he ever quit those things. He was perfectly fine to stay within that. In fact, Paul even tells us, if you're called, meaning you hear the gospel, you believe on Christ, in whatever state you're called, stay there. If you're in the military, stay in the military. If you're a slave, be a slave. Now, if you get the opportunity to be made free, take it. But otherwise, whatever situation you're in when you get saved, that's the situation you're in. And unless it's something that's immoral, you stay there and you be a light in that area. That's what we're supposed to do. Now let's go to Acts chapter 13. Acts chapter 13, this is Paul's first missionary journey. Taking the gospel to the Gentiles, coming to the island of Cyprus, kind of there between Israel and Turkey on the Mediterranean. Verse number 12, then the deputy, when he saw what was done, believed, being astonished at the doctrine of the Lord. And it says, Paul and his company loosed from Paphos, came to Perga and Pamphylia. So they made it Turkey. Now, a deputy is a governor. That's what the word deputy means. It's a governor. Again, nothing to indicate that he ever left that, or that he lost his position, or anything like that. He just kept going as governor. Boy, wouldn't it be good if we had some saved governors? One in particular. Maybe three. Acts chapter 16, let's go there. Acts chapter 16, verse 35. It's Paul at Philippi. They've been in prison. When it was day, the magistrates sent the sergeants, saying, let these men go. And the keeper of the prison told the saying to Paul, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Now therefore depart and go in peace. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us openly uncondemned, being Romans, and have cast us into prison. And now do they thrust us out privily? Nay, verily. But let them come themselves and fetch us out. And the sergeants told the words unto the magistrates, and they feared when they heard that they were Romans. And they came and besought them and brought them out, and desired them to depart out of the city. And they went out of the prison and entered into the house of Lydia. So what's going on here? Paul says, hey, I am a citizen, and I have rights. As a Roman citizen, I have rights, and my rights have been violated in this situation. I have been beaten, I have been imprisoned, and there is no charge against me. I have broken no law. Now, this was really bad for the soldiers that did this, because they could lose their head as a result of that. But Paul wasn't afraid to say, hey, look, I'm a Roman citizen. We have rights, and I intend to enjoy my rights as a Roman citizen. And that's exactly what he did. He didn't, notice, Paul took advantage of his rights as a Roman citizen. That's the blank there. He took advantage of his rights as a Roman citizen. Just like in America, we have rights. We have rights granted to us by our Bill of Rights. And we have every right to enjoy those. We can expect those, or we should, even though we're Christians. And it's okay to say, hey, you're trying to silence me. You're saying I can't preach that, or I can't witness, or I can't tell people about Jesus. Wait a minute. I have a right as an American citizen. You want to put me in jail? Fine. But I'm going to come back after you, because that is a violation of my rights as an American. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. We don't have to roll over and just let the government walk all over us. Now, Romans 13. Romans 13, verse 6. For this cause pay ye tribute. He's talking about how the powers that be, the government, has been ordained by God, and that's their full-time job. And so for that reason, we pay taxes to support them, so they can do that job continually. Although most of the time it's a waste of money for us. But anyway, for this cause pay tribute also. For they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues. Tribute to whom tribute is due. Custom to whom custom. Fear to whom fear. Honor to whom honor. So, notice, we are to pay taxes. Now, our government is kind to us and allows us as a church to be exempt from the payment of taxes. We don't have to pay property taxes. We don't have to pay sales tax, stuff like that. And that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. But that could change. That could change. I mean, they could rewrite the IRS codes and stuff like that, and that could change. And we'd have to pay taxes. And that wouldn't be the first time that's happened in history. In England, they have to pay taxes. That's an American thing. And it is what it is. But we pay taxes. As citizens, we pay taxes. It'd be nice if we could be say, I'm a Christian, and it's against my religion to pay taxes. Not that you'd be able to justify that biblically, because you got to do something with that verse. And I appreciate Ken Hovind and all of the work that he's done for creation science, but he just went way off the deep end on this one and not paying taxes for years and years and years and years, claiming to be a missionary state and not having to pay taxes for himself. And it's just unfortunate. You kind of got those mad geniuses, and it's like, you're so smart, but then how did you miss this? So, church, we can be involved in state affairs. We can function as normal, regular citizens. Now, what about the state? So God's purpose for human government is twofold. There is a divine purpose, and there is a secular purpose. Okay? This is what gets kind of difficult sometimes. So let's go to 1 Peter. We're going to come back to Romans 13. But 1 Peter, chapter 4. Any questions so far?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Anybody else have a question? Okay, right. Well, we'll come. Well, let's just look at the passage. So 1 Peter chapter 4, and actually let's go up to verse number 12. It says, Beloved, think not strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you. So now notice here, he mentions the fiery trial. He's not just using wordplay here or trying to talk about hard times. When he speaks of the fiery trial, he literally means fire, because at this point in time, Rome was burning Christians. This was after Rome had burned, and the Roman Emperor had made Christianity illegal, and so they were trying to exterminate the Christians, and one of the means of execution was to burn them. And so this is what Peter's alluding to here. It's a fiery trial, but notice he says it is to try you or to test you. Okay? Now, drop down to verse number 17. Peter says, For the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it first begin at us, what shall the end be of them that obey not the gospel of God? And if the righteous scarcely be saved, where shall the ungodly and sinners appear? Wherefore let them that suffer according to the will of God commit the keeping of their souls to him in well-doing as unto a faithful Creator. So he says, it is time, the time in which we live, it is time that judgment begin at the house of God. That judgment is the test. It is time for testing in the house of God. And that testing purifies the church. It purges, prunes the church. And so this is being done by the government. They are persecuting Christians, killing them off. And notice here in verse 19, he says, Wherefore let them that suffer according to the will of God. Now, when he talks about suffering here, he's not talking about, your back aching. Now, you can suffer with a backache. You can suffer with all sorts of physical maladies and all sorts of things. You can suffer. What he's talking about here is the government persecution that they're suffering. And he says, if you're suffering that, it's according to the will of God. Why? It's a test. To try you. Now notice here, in his divine plan, God's purpose with the government is to bless and test, or to judge. See, this is one of the things that's very difficult for us, is we have a failure to see beyond human government to God's government. We fail to see that God uses government to accomplish his purposes. You look back in the Old Testament, and all these nations that came against Israel, was it good for them to come against Israel? No, not really. In fact, it was a really bad thing, because every one of them that came against Israel, God judged them for coming against Israel. However, each of those that came against Israel was God's act of judgment against the nation. Oh, yeah. For sure. Every one of those countries is like impoverished. They've never been, fruitful countries. And except for oil, I guess. But they're just desolate places. See, God has a plan. He has an end game, right? We've done the book of Revelation. That's the end game. And all the governments of the world are involved in that end game. And so, does government do what it's supposed to do all the time? In fact, most of the time, no, it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. But God allows that because that's accomplishing his end game. That's his divine plan. They're still working for him. They're not doing what he wants them to do necessarily, but they're still working for him. And it's easy to lose sight of the fact that God is working, and he intends to work through the government to accomplish his purposes. Proverbs 21:1, king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, as the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will. King doesn't function exclusively by himself. He's not entirely autonomous. God is working to accomplish his purpose through those kings and through those governors. Now, in a secular plan, God's purpose with the government is to maintain civil order. That is the purpose of government, to maintain civil order, to keep people in check. And this is done by rewarding the good and punishing the evil. That's what they're supposed to do. Reward the good, punish the evil. So, 1 Peter chapter 2. First Peter 2, verse 11. It says, Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Now watch this. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme or unto governors. Okay, now watch. Keep the context in mind here. Are Christians being favored by the government at this time when Peter's writing? No. They're being burned alive at the stake. And he tells them to submit themselves to every ordinance of man, whether it be to the king or unto governors. Now watch. As unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. So notice here, Peter says the purpose of government is to praise them that do well and to punish the evildoers. That's the purpose of government. That goes all the way back to Genesis 9, when government was first instituted. It says, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And so somebody has to be the deciding factor. This person has committed a crime. They have to be punished for that. That's government's job. It's to maintain civil order. Now, let's go to Romans 13. And I think we're just going to hang out in Romans 13 now. I will get to the answer to your question in just a moment. It's already in here because that is one that I anticipated. Now, if it was Wayne's question, I wouldn't have anticipated Wayne's question. So I'm glad he didn't raise his hand. Notice here. Let's start with verse 1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive of themselves damnation, meaning judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So, now notice here, let's clarify a couple points here. In verse 4, government is the minister of God. That doesn't mean that they always function as God's ministers, but they are ordained of God as his ministers. Doesn't mean they do a good job. Just talking about their position. And in verse 3 and 4, they are the rewarder of good and punisher of evil. Now, in general, that is true. If you be a moral, upstanding citizen, generally, government's going to leave you alone. Generally. If you're going the speed limit down the road, you don't have to look in the rearview mirror when the police officer passes by. Just, it's just habit. It shouldn't be. It was like a police officer drives by or he passed one. I always got to look in the rearview mirror. Okay, just make sure he's not turning around. I'd only go 5 over. That's what they allow. Depending on who it is, some of them allow you to go 9 over, as long as you're no more than 9 over. But I don't want to push that one. So if they're the rewarder of good, punisher of evil, who determines what is good? Who's the determining factor here? Who is it that determines what is good? God does. Who do they work for? They are God's ministers. So who is supposed to determine the good? God determines what is good, and God determines what is evil. So they have an obligation before God, as God's ministers, to judge based on His standard. Not the standard of the people. So as God's ministers, the government has a responsibility to God. That's your next blank. Let's talk about their sphere of authority for a minute. The government is ordained by God to enforce certain aspects of morality. You hear people all the time say when it comes to politics, you shouldn't legislate morality. Well, anytime you pass a law, you've just created another standard of morality. You've just said one thing is right and another thing is wrong. That's morality. And you can't be a legislator at all if you can't legislate morality, because that's what it is. That's the job. You're making laws. You're saying this is right, this is wrong. That's morality. So that is the responsibility of government. All of God's commands fit into 2 categories. Okay? Remember, 2 great commandments. Lawyer came to Jesus. What is the greatest commandment of the law? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength. Second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that's typically, and Jesus says, on these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now, basically, that divides up the 10 commandments. You have 4, the first 4 deal with our relationship to God. Love God. The second grouping of 6 deals with our relationship to those around us. Now, how that is often interpreted as 2 tables of the law. First table, our relationship to God. Second, our relationship to man. Now, it's actually not accurate, because the 2 tables of stone that Moses came down from the mountain, both of them had the 10 commandments on them. But it sounds good. And so when we talk about government and what they are to enforce and what they are responsible for, they are not responsible for the first table of the law. It's not for them to dictate a person's religion, as long as that religion is not immoral. If somebody has a religion that says, you can have 15 or 20 wives, or as many wives as you want, or you could marry 10-year-old girls or something like that, and it's okay to murder your wife if she gets out of line or something like that. Obviously, then the government has the right and responsibility to step in and say, I don't care if that's your religious belief. You need to get out of this country if that's the case, because that's not okay here. Because that violates the second table of the law that deals with our relationship to those around us. And that second table of the law regulates the morals of society. Now notice this. This is in the text here in Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13, the entirety of Romans 13 is about the government and their responsibility, and our responsibility to them. Now notice here, verse 8. It says, owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. Now watch what he says. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Now, some commentators, like in my Bible, it just says the law of love toward neighbors. There's the heading of this paragraph. But a lot of people want to separate that and say, well, verses 8 through the end of the chapter are just kind of general commands for Christians. And there's a sense in which that's true, but isn't all of chapter 13 general commands for Christians too? And it's interesting what he doesn't put in there. Because he's quoting the law. So are Christians allowed to have idols? Make graven images? Are we to have other gods before the true and living God? Is it okay for us to take the Lord's name in vain? No, of course not. Well, why doesn't he put those in there? It's because he's not dealing with things regarding religion, so to speak, and government enforcement of religion, because that's not the government's responsibility. The government's responsibility is to uphold the second table of God's law, so to speak. And that is, notice, they are, the last sentence there of that paragraph, they are ordained to govern and maintain order in society. That's what he's dealing with. He's dealing with societal relationships. That's what government has a responsibility to. And Paul lists 6 categories that falls into. And these are their sphere of authority. Thou shalt not commit adultery. So obviously, it's laws regarding human sexuality. Thou shalt not kill. Laws regarding the sanctity of human life. Should the government step in when it comes to the issue of abortion? Yes, absolutely. They have the responsibility, and they're going to be held to. I feel sorry for the politicians that said, go for it on Roe v. Wade, and the judges, and all these people that were involved in getting all this stuff passed initially. Does the government have the right to pass laws regarding human sexuality? Yeah, to a degree. We have laws in our books on statutory rape, right? So you have a 46-year-old man and a 13-year-old girl. Well, they're both consenting. Well, but the government says, yeah, you got to wait until she's 18. Or depending on which state you're in. Some states, they've kind of been moving that back for bad reasons. But, what about an adult and a child, a little child? Should the government have laws regarding those things? Absolutely they should. And you and I both know that they should. Because when it goes on and people get away with it, what happens to us? We're ready to take up arms. Right? Thou shalt not steal, so laws regarding personal property. Thou shalt not bear false witness, laws regarding contracts and oaths. Thou shalt not covet, laws regarding the moderation of spending and debt. Does the government have the right to come in and say, if you don't pay your debts, we're going to lock you up? I should love thy neighbor as thyself, laws regarding the general welfare of society. As annoying as they are sometimes, the speed limit laws, building codes, all of them are annoying. Some of them are put in place, and the only reason it's there is because somebody's just trying to make another dollar. But generally, in principle, those are there for the general well-being of society. Government's well within their bounds for that. As annoying as they are sometimes. Now, what about exceptions? Are there exceptions to our submission to the powers that be? Of course. There's a lot of exceptions to things. Because the Bible presents things the way God intends it for it to be. So when he says that the powers that be are the minister of God and that they reward the good, punish the evil, that's the way God intends it to be. And generally, that's probably true. Most of the time, governments are not, in general, trying to go out and punish people that are doing good things. Generally. Although that does change from time to time. But the Scriptures acknowledge the reality of exceptions the way God intends. I like 1 John 2:1. Little children, these things write I unto you that ye sin not. Does God intend for us to continue to sin after we get saved? Any of us sin after we got saved? Once or twice, right? Well, what does he say? He doesn't stop there. He says, these things write unto you that you sin not. But, here's the exception, if any man sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. So, it's God's intention, God's perfect plan, you get saved, don't sin. But he also realizes the sinfulness of man, and he says, you know what? But there's an exception. And so, it's the same way with the government. We are to submit to the government. But there are times where what they tell us to do or not do is a violation of what God commands us to do. What do we do then? Well, that's Romans. Notice here, verse 11, 13 verse 11. That knowing the time. What time are we in? We're in the last days. Things are going to get better or worse in the last days? Evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. So it's going to get worse. So that knowing the time, that now it is high time to wake out of sleep. For now is our salvation near, the one we believe. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness. Let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness. Now, he connects these things together. So rioting and drunkenness. Rioting has to do with kind of that party lifestyle. Drunkenness is obvious. It says not in chambering and wantonness. Chambering, what's that? Key word there is chamber, referring to a bedroom. It's people sharing bedroom. They're not married. We would call it shacking up, living together. You know, people say, well, you know, there's nothing in the Bible that forbids you to, that says you can't live together if you're not married. Well, it says right there, we're not supposed to do it. Chambering and wantonness. Wantonness is just kind of that loose, anything to fulfill my desires, not in strife and envying. But put you on the Lord Jesus Christ, make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. Now, it's interesting here because Paul is acknowledging what he stated earlier about government. That's the intention. But the times that we're in, it's not going to be that way. Because these things here that Paul says we're to cast off, those are things that the government approved of. So it doesn't matter if the government approves of it. You know, it's like marijuana. Well, the government said it's okay. Doesn't matter. Government says drinking's okay too. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they say it's okay. And so, Paul's instruction about submission to the government are generally true. Rulers reward the good, punish the evil. Coming up on your blank here, when a government is following its God-ordained responsibilities, we should be the first to acknowledge it and support it. But when they pervert their authority, we obey what we can, but we remain faithful to Christ, our highest authority. We obey where we can. The government oversteps its bounds and says, you know what? We're closing all the houses of worship. Okay, well, that's an overstep of your bounds. That's a major overstep of your bounds. But it doesn't mean it's okay to go ahead and break the speed limit just because they're perverting their judgment. Doesn't mean we can go riot in the streets and start going into businesses and pulling TVs out and stuff like that and taking them home. No, we obey the laws where we can, and those that are bad laws because they violate God's law, we obey God's law. That's simple as it gets. So what Paul mentions in verse 13 of the things that we are to cast off, things that in his day were not only legal, they're government sanctioned. What are we to do? We be the best Christians you can be. And when the laws mandate violating God's law, we obey God rather than man. So that separates church and state. They have two different spheres. They have two spheres of operation, two different plans. They can influence each other. That's okay. But they're not to be joined together. And the separation of church and state is a biblical Baptist distinctive, and when it's denied, the consequences are tyranny, bloodshed, spiritual darkness, and a hatred of soul liberty, which is what we're going to see as we start next week into getting into the history aspect of this thing. All right, I think that's it.